Well, hello, everybody. We'll go ahead and get this meeting started. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Bajent.
Here.
Halliburton.
Here.
Haney Keith. Nash.
Here.
Willetts.
Here.
Woodings.
Here.
5 present, 1 absent.
Great, thank you. So we've got two items, but really connected to two items that are connected to one item, and then we have an executive session at the end. So first up, we have the follow-up from the independent investigation on retired BPD Captain Bringleson. And just as the chief comes up, and we've both, I think, we'll start with Nicole Schaefer from OPA, and then with both the chief and deputy chief from BPD. And I just want to remind folks that, and council, as you'll recall, this started when we all received the startling news last fall of the retired BPD captains' outward affiliations with white supremacist groups, and knowing that as a community, to remain safe, community trust and police department is key. And so we acted swiftly. Today's focus is a follow-up on the recommendations that we received from the independent investigation that we began after the news. And so just some dates to remember. May 17th, the council received the recommendations, as well as shortly after, on May 19th, Boise Police Department was tasked with following up and on the recommendations and returning to council with more information related to the recommendations. Then on June 12th, the liaisons to OPA, both council members and myself, directed OPA to conduct the document review. And that's what Nicole is here today to provide an update. And I'm confident in our plan for moving Boise through this as we invest in and pursue safety, justice, and accountability in our safe city. This is the first return of both departments as they were directed and requested by council and myself. And so I want to welcome first OPA and then BPD up to the microphone for your information and presentation. Welcome, Nicole. Nicole, just a second. I want to make sure that the mic's got you.
Hey, thanks, Chief. I'm Nicole Schaefer,
Yep.
the interim director of the OPA. As the mayor indicated recently, Mayor McLean and the city council members, Holly Woodings, Jimmy Halliburton, and Patrick Badger tasked the OPA with reviewing the documents that had been collected for the investigation that was relating to former Boise Police Department Captain Matthew Bringleson. The number of the documents is quite large and varies in type from training plans and policies, hour-long recordings, investigative files, emails, evaluations and surveys, internal affair files, and departmental policies and procedures. The scope of the OPA's review is to determine if there are any examples or evidence showing that retired Boise Police Department Captain Matthew Bringleson's stated racist beliefs infected either his policing during his employment, his interactions with the community while acting as a representative of the Boise Police Department, his former roles and responsibilities in the Boise Police Department, and whether those stated racist beliefs were transmitted to or imposed upon those he supervised. And finally, whether any city resources were used in the manufacture of racist materials or content. The documents are incredibly large in volume. It's been estimated that it's probably equal to 253 gigabytes of data. And we've put a conservative estimate of 80 hours needed to review that. The review is going to be conducted by outside counsel for the OPA and myself in parts. We are currently working on that, and we'll be preparing a report with our findings for the mayor and council when that review is complete. It did take some time to get access for myself and then for outside counsel to get those documents. We have all of that, and at this time, the review has begun.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Nicole?
Madam Mayor, I
Yes.
just have a budget question. So Nicole, is there enough funding currently in OPA's budget to cover that document review?
I believe so. This is a new outside counsel. We're at the beginning of the contract, so I believe that it is adequate.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
pretty sure you've done a good estimate and looked at it, but 80 hours to look at that much material seems brisk. So keep us updated. And if that changes, I mean, that's like about 1,000 documents an hour, I think, based on Bromwich's estimate. So if it starts to look like a different picture than what you see right now, just let us know and keep us updated.
Thank you, and we definitely will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Chief, welcome. And Deputy Chief, welcome.
Madam Mayor, members of council, thank you for having us today. We are, as has been stated, following up on the independent investigation and the recommendations that were made. We have gone through those recommendations at this time, and we have had many discussions related to them. We have reached out to city partners to discuss. We've had internal discussions, and we are here today to share some information as well as some action that we have taken, are currently taking, and will be taking in the future related to those recommendations. So the plan for this afternoon's meeting is that we will discuss, first of all, some information that I believe the council requested and would like to have in relation to those recommendations. And I'm going to actually turn some time over to Deputy Chief Brooks to address those items of information. And then I will come back and address some of the actions. And so we have those recommendations split up into two different categories, one information and one actions. So Deputy Chief Brooks will speak with you and cover the topics of recruitment, promotional processes, external speaking engagements, and then our complaint process within the department and any changes that have been made or steps that have been taken. And so with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to him. And then when he is done with that, I will come back and address some of the actions that we've taken on 4 other categories. And then we will stand for questions. Of course, anytime through the process, feel free to interject with a question.
Great,
Thank you.
thanks. Deputy Chief, welcome.
Good afternoon, Mayor and members of council. Do we have? Again, good afternoon, Mayor and members of council. My name is Tammany Brooks. I'm the Deputy Chief, and I'm here to talk to you today, as Chief Weiniger mentioned, about information that you had requested in response to the independent investigation that was reported back on in May by Mr. Bromwich. And when Mr. Bromwich reported to you, he had mentioned that there were a number of provisional findings and recommendations that he was making, but he also added the caveat that some of the information was already known to the department at the time and had either already been corrected or was in the process of being remedied at that point. And so now I'm going to talk to you about the things that we have done in some of those areas. The first is in recruitment, hiring, and training. And this is something that is very near and dear to my heart. And it's one of the things that I feel is one of my top priorities, is ensuring that we are able to fill the existing vacancies that exist within the police department, but do so in a way that we are seeking, recruiting, and obtaining the highest caliber of recruit and person who should be working not only in this profession, but specifically within the Boise Police Department. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process. It starts off with the recruitment process, and we have really taken an initiative in being proactive and seeking out quality recruits. And for many years, our profession was a benefactor of a wide range of people who wanted to enter into this profession. And that's not the case these days. And so we currently have a recruiting team that consists of approximately 20 employees throughout the police department, myself included. And we are currently working to engage with the community, ensuring that our department is reflective of the community that we serve. But again, going out and seeking the most talented and perfect people for this profession, again, for this department. So we do that by advertising and going out to recruiting events. Those events could be something like a job fair, or we have been going to high schools, to colleges, to military bases, and actually just even out in the community, interacting with people who may or may not have an interest in becoming a police officer, and maybe dispelling some of the myths of what it takes to be a police officer, and trying to encourage people who might have an interest in applying. When they apply, what you see on the screen is the process in which a recruit needs to, or an applicant needs to go through. It starts with a written exam, and that written exam is a pass-fail with a certain score. I will tell you that one of the concerns that Mr. Bromwich had mentioned was ensuring that we did not lower our hiring standards. And this written exam is one area in which we have actually raised the standards, and a passing score previously, what was a benchmark set by the company that administers a test, we have actually raised it to a higher threshold because we are seeking that higher caliber of candidate. Candidates then need to seek, or need to go out and pass a physical readiness test, and then they will go through an oral board interview. If they pass the oral board interview, they move on to the background phase of the investigation, in which a background investigator who works for the department goes through and learns about that person's life, talks to previous employers, to family members, to friends, to find out what type of character that person has exhibited throughout their life. And then another area in which we have raised the bar from previous times is that we have reinstituted the polygraph exam. And there was a brief period of time in which we did not implement the polygraph for pre-employment purposes, but we have re-implemented that as well. And then if the candidate passes that, there is the pre-employment medical testing, which consists of a medical exam as well as a psychological exam. And then if they go through all of that and successfully complete it, there is a final review and an offer made at the chief's office level. Once an applicant is hired, the training process consists of a 22-week in-house Boise Police Academy for entry-level applicants. If the person is a lateral who had previously worked at another agency, it's a 7-week academy. And then successfully completing the academy, there's a 14+ week field training program. And then if they complete that, the person is subject to a probationary period of either 6 months after they complete the field training program, or 1 year after the date of hire, whichever is the latter. Now, when someone becomes a Boise police officer, if they wish to promote, the first rank that they could promote to is a sergeant. We have a corporal position that is a time and grade for people who have served a period of time in the Boise Police Department. But if they wish to promote both the officer level as well as the corporal and then the sergeant positions, those are all union positions. They are all governed by the collective labor agreement. And in that collective labor agreement, there are civil service rules which dictate how the process is run. And so if someone wishes to get promoted to sergeant, they had to have been a Boise police officer for at least 4 years. That's a minimum requirement to apply to be a sergeant within the organization. The testing process consists of a written exam, which is weighted at 35% of the applicant's score. And that written test is created by a committee. And that committee must have at least 2 members. So per the collective labor agreement, the committee has to consist of several members, and at least 2 of those members have to be union members at the rank of sergeant. So they are part of the process that creates the written test, which will test the people who are applying to be a sergeant. Then they move on to a practical assessment. The practical assessment generally consists of a tabletop exercise of some sort of tactical scenario, as well as some sort of communication scenario, whether it be a personnel matter or some sort of counseling issue, something to test their ability to communicate effectively and ensure that they understand the policies and procedures that would be required of them if they were in that sergeant role. That equates for 100% of their score for the sergeant's exam. So they are then, based on that score, placed on an eligibility list ranked from the highest rank down to the lowest. If there is an opening for a sergeant, per the collective labor agreement, we as a department, the chief, has to fill that vacancy within 45 days. In that 45-day period, the chief is given a list of the top 3 candidates. And those are the only people that he can select from at that time. So they take the top 3 candidates, and those 3 candidates are then subject to a peer review. And so you heard Mr. Bromwich talk about the Survey Monkey. Well, employees are afforded the opportunity to evaluate their peer through this Survey Monkey. One change that was recently made was previously the surveys were anonymously submitted, and now people who submit the surveys actually have to attach their name to it in case we need to follow up with any questions relating to the information that they provide us. And then there's a chief's interview that is conducted generally with the chief and myself, and then the chief has the pick from one of those 3 people. This slide is just language that's included in the collective labor agreement that outlines exactly what I talked about. It consists of 3 components: the written exam, the practical exam, and peer and supervisor review, as well as the fact that the chief, per the collective labor agreement, has the right to bypass candidate who is one of those 3, but only 3 times without having just cause for passing that person over after that.
Deputy Chief, before you leave that slide, that's the most recent CLA, but this process, can you go back to the other one? How long has this process been part of the CLA?
I went back to prior CLAs and prior sergeant promotional examination announcements back to 2015. And this was the identical process the entire time. So it's been at least for the past 8 years.
Okay.
Madam Mayor, while we are stopped here, Deputy Chief, thanks for being here. Question on this. So it's your top 3 candidates that get to kind of move on in the process. If the top 3 candidates don't perform very well on the written exam or the practical exam, is it still the top 3? So, I mean, can you potentially have top 3 candidates that didn't necessarily perform at a high level, or is there a benchmark that they have to achieve above in order to make it into a qualified candidate?
So there is a minimum passing score, which is set for the sergeants. But let's just say, for example, if there were 10 people on the list, so 10 people scored above the baseline of 70. Depending upon the number of sergeant promotions, we could get down to that lower, someone who maybe just barely passed the assessment center. And at that point, the chief would be obligated to pick someone who was at that rank.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Madam Mayor. So thank you for being here and walking through this. So I make sure I understand it correctly. How exams are administered, it creates a list of people who are ranked based on the exam scores. And then for some period of time, are positions filled from that list? Is there a new test each time? Like, because you mentioned working down the list, and then eventually I imagine the chief gets in a situation where he simply has to hire somebody because of the 45-day clock. Is that, so it's not I've stumbled all the way through it. Is the issue that exams are only administered occasionally and then that list sort of sits there for a long period of time?
Thank you for that question. I apologize for not mentioning that earlier. In previous years, a sergeant's list was good for 2 years. And if it had been exhausted prior to that 2-year mark, then we would test again. If it hadn't, the people who were still on that list, that list would die, and then we would have to retest. Recently, we changed that to 1 year.
Okay. So there's a scenario where perhaps you have a lot of positions to fill. You have 10 people who met the minimum qualifications, but realistically, 3 of them are great. You hire them, but you still have to continue to hire open positions. And so because of the nature of that list and because of the nature of the 45-day clock, am I right? The chief is just sort of forced to hire somebody in that situation?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
So as I mentioned, officers, corporals, and sergeants are part of the union and therefore governed by the collective labor agreement. Lieutenants are not part of the union, but that is a change that only took place within the past few years. And I don't have the exact date. I believe Chief Weiniger does if you need it. But so they're not in the union, but there is still some legacy language in the CLA that specifically relates to the promotional process for lieutenants. And so part of that process is governed through the civil service section of the collective labor agreement for lieutenants. If a lieutenant or if a sergeant wants to apply to be a lieutenant, they're eligible to do so immediately. If someone is a sergeant within our organization and a lieutenant's position opens up, they're automatically eligible to apply. That process consists of an announcement and then a written test, which is rated at 20% of their overall score. There are practical scenarios which account for 40% of their score. And then there is an oral board process that consists of not only command staff members, but generally when we start in the realm of management, lieutenant and captain, we begin including members of the community as well as other city staff members. And the oral board score is the other 40% of that score. And then that creates a ranking system for the lieutenants. And then there's a chief's interview and the chief has the ability to select the person off of that list. And then again, here's the language that I mentioned that is currently in our collective labor agreement. This was previously in the civil service rules, but it was recently adopted into the most recent version of the CLA. Now, moving on to the captain's process is not governed in any way by the collective labor agreement. The process is very similar, except there is an initial resume submittal, which is reviewed by the chief and the chief's office, and that is a pass-fail score. There is a written assessment that goes along with that, as well as an oral board panel. And it says an oral board panel, there's generally multiple interview panels, and that generally consists of not only command staff members, but other agency executives throughout the Treasure Valley and other areas, city staff members, and more members from the community. And then after that, there's a chief's interview, and the chief has the pick of the list when someone is going for the rank of captain. One of the things that I've failed to mention, and this is applicable throughout not only the entry-level process of the oral boards, but each step of the promotional process. And this is another item which we have recently instituted, and it was designed to eliminate subjectivity in the process, is the creation of a rubric scoring method for the oral board. So as we create the questions, there is also a rubric associated with it that says what a high score answer would contain, what a middle of the road score answer would contain, and someone who didn't answer the question. And so it takes away a lot of the subjectivity so that we know across the board if someone is providing a solid, sound answer to a question, we already have identified what it is that we're looking for in those questions, and that way it could be scored appropriately and objectively.
And Deputy Chief, when you say recently, what do you mean by that? When did that change take place?
Within the past year.
Okay. And then just another question, you might have already said it. With the announcement, who's eligible to put their name in for captain?
I can only speak from my experience in the most recent captain's exam. It's the only one that I've worked within the police department to be a part of. And that was open to lieutenants within the organization, as well as people outside of the organization if they met minimum qualifications, which had to do with their time and grade as a lieutenant or above at another agency. And then there's also, I believe, an educational requirement. And if I recall correctly, I believe they have to have at least a bachelor's degree.
Madam Mayor, Deputy Chief, would you mind going back one slide? Oh, maybe two. There's the one. So I'm curious, and feel free to tell me to hold this question for later if it's going to come up at a later point. In this process, is there one of these areas that sort of incorporates past performance as a police officer? So like whether it's in the oral board interviews, is there a spot where people are talking about how this person performed as an officer at BPD before in the past? And how is that weighed in?
Thank you for the question. I believe that there are some questions that give the applicant an opportunity to talk about past performance. One of the things that Chief Weiniger will speak to is performance evaluations and a way in which we're looking to start implementing those, and that could be used for future processes.
Great. So I guess to my understanding that there's maybe some of that happens within some of the questioning on an oral board, but there isn't necessarily a specific component in the process at this point that's based off of past performance.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Brooks. In any of these processes, is there a time that the internal affairs files of candidates are reviewed? That's my whole question, I guess.
I don't have the answer to that. We would have to
Okay.
get back to you.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor,
Mhm.
I'm sorry, but now I feel like we're beating up on you. And after that, I didn't understand your answer to Council Pro Tem Halliburton, because as I look at this, the procedure is a written assessment, which is going to be scored, and then practical scenarios, which are going to be scored, and then the command oral board, which I think you just explained has objective criteria where a good answer to a question has this or has that, which is then scored. So where in there does the assessment of someone's past performance, which is a more subjective factor, come in? Because at the end of this, you get a test score that goes on a list, and then that kind of determines a lot of the outcome, I would think.
Thank you for the question. I think my answer to that would be if they were asked to talk about their experience and their assignments throughout their career as a police officer and a supervisor, they could talk about some of their accomplishments.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Another area that was brought up by Mr. Bromwich in the independent investigation specifically related to external speaking engagements. And when we looked at that particular topic, there were two types of external speaking engagements that we focused on. One is if an employee is speaking externally to another group, but doing so in the official capacity as a Boise Police Department employee. Their behavior and what they say during that speaking engagement is governed within a couple of different policies. Policy 342 specifically relating to community engagement. They have to check in, so the person has to check in with their supervisor and get permission to speak at that particular engagement. And that policy also outlines what type of engagements, speaking engagements, they can or cannot speak at. And then there's also the policy relating specifically to the conduct of the employee and if they engage in conduct that's unbecoming of an employee of the Boise Police Department. And so if an employee were to speak and were to say something that was outside of the core values and not representative of a police officer and of a Boise police officer specifically, then this policy would adhere to them. And then there's the external speaking engagements if they are doing so off duty. They're not representing the Boise Police Department. So we need to break that into two separate categories too, because some of our employees actually receive pay for secondary employment. And if they do have a secondary employment that could cause a situation in which they would be speaking publicly. First of all, that secondary employment has to be approved previously by the chief of police. And so anybody who is out there engaged in any secondary employment, whether or not they're speaking publicly, that secondary employment has to be approved by the chief of police. If they're not being paid by the police department, then we do not review, approve, or regulate their speech at those particular speaking engagements. However, the prior policy relating to conduct unbecoming an employee of the police department still applies to them, because that policy applies whether you are on duty or off duty. And then we're actually still looking at future updates in our standard of conduct policy that will apply both in the official and unofficial capacity. And then the last area that I'm going to speak to is the complaint process. And one of the concerns was if there was an employee within the police department who had a complaint about another employee, what is the mechanism for bringing that forward? And that is something that has changed within the past year as well. And just to kind of give you a definition, a complaint is a singular incident involving one or more allegations of misconduct. So a complaint per se could have multiple allegations of misconduct, but the complaint is looked at individually. It could be either citizen generated or department initiated, either by a supervisor or by another member of the department, whether they are a police officer or whether they're a member of professional staff. And when a complaint is brought forward, it is investigated either by a supervisor or by one of the investigators in our internal affairs division, depending upon the nature and severity of the allegation. So the process forward is if there is a complaint received, the investigation is completed. And when the investigation is completed, and that investigation is designed to be a fact-finding mission, it's designed to be objective, just to go out and gather the facts and bring it to the reviewer, the manager of that division, who in this case would be a lieutenant, who would review the investigation for thoroughness and completeness, and then would issue findings based upon the information that was obtained in the investigation. Those findings are not only a finding to determine whether or not the allegation is sustained, not sustained, unfounded, if the officer was exonerated, but also goes through a chain of command process. So when the lieutenant makes that determination, it goes to that lieutenant's captain, who reviews it and can either agree or controvert the findings. It then goes to myself, and then depending upon the severity of the allegations, it could go to the chief's office. And so complaints that don't arise to, if sustained, the corrective action would result in economic sanctions. So if it doesn't result in economic sanctions, meaning a suspension or a demotion or termination, that generally stops with me. However, if there is a recommendation for a suspension, demotion, or termination, then that goes to the chief's office. It also automatically triggers a police review board. And the police review board is made up of the accused officer's chain of command. And that gives the officer an opportunity to come in to provide any mitigating circumstances or information. And then the officer's chain of command reviews not only the recommended corrective action, but weighs the information that was just provided by the officer and makes a determination as to what they believe the proposed corrective action should be. And then the officer has an appeal right that starts off with a meeting with the chief for a predetermination hearing, but then can also move forward to either a hearing officer or an arbitration.
Madam Mayor, Deputy Chief, I have a question as it relates to this, because in the budget that we'll do in the next hour or so, there's a new position for professional standards division training or staffing. Can you tell us how that position would work within this framework?
Yes, thank you for that question. So in the professional standards division, there are several areas that the professional standards division oversees. And almost everything that I've talked about falls under that division. So the hiring, the recruiting, the promotional process, as well as the internal affairs process, all falls under the purview of the professional standards. And right now we have one captain and 4 part-time background investigators And then I believe we have 2 or 3 internal affairs investigators as well as an administrative person. This lieutenant that would be part of this division would oversee many of the processes that I'm talking about right now, including the complaint process, to ensure that not only are the complaints properly vetted, but also properly investigated, and ensure that everything is being handled according to our policies and procedures.
Madam Mayor, is this process only for union employees or for non-union as well? Or is there a different set of complaint process procedures for non-union? Like, who does it apply to?
This generally applies to the sworn members. Our policies and procedures do apply to our professional staff, but their discipline and corrective action policy generally falls under the general orders of the city. The 3 sworn members of the department, based on changes that we have recently made to streamline and to clarify if there is an internal complaint from one employee about another, where those complaints go. The 3 people who are separate from this process, in a way, this process still exists, but the routing mechanism changes a little bit, is if the alleged violator, the person accused of misconduct, is either myself, the chief, or the captain of internal affairs, in which, because we're part of the overall chain of command of this entire process, we have eliminated the need to bring that complaint forward to us, and people are directed to go directly to human resources.
Great. And then are there separate union procedures or union protections that fit into this as well? Or does this capture and include, all of the employee discipline rights of a union employee with respect to consulting with their union representatives, having the union representatives present? I mean, is this the process that they're present at and participating in?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great.
So that concludes the information regarding things that we have already done to address some of the issues that were brought forward in the independent investigation. And now Chief Weiniger is going to speak to you about some of the action items that we are currently taking and will be taking regarding some of the other concerns that were brought forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Brooks. Madam Mayor, members of the council, do you have any questions about some of the things that he covered that might pertain to me, or do you have questions of me in any of those items before I launch into the next portion?
Madam Mayor, it's more just of a concern if you have a second to respond to it, and it has to do with the test scorings, particularly around promotions to sergeant, but also above. But like what I saw and what I interpreted was you administer a test. People who take the test either make the threshold or they don't. And then, to put it bluntly, it seems like you're stuck with the list for a period of time. And as you work through it, you may have people that you don't want to promote, but you're required by either the CLA or other things, you're required to promote them. And obviously, we're not speaking about a particular person or about the lovely people who you have promoted, but it seems like your hands are really tied when making some promotional decisions. And I wonder if my sense is correct, and if not, what's wrong, and what do I need to know about that?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Bajan, thank you for that question. And I would say that is partially the case. And let me elaborate just a little bit on that. In the sergeant promotional process in particular, that is very much governed or influenced by the collective labor agreement. And so we do have some specific things we have to adhere to, so that once somebody has passed the process and are on the eligibility list, then we are obligated to choose from the top 3. And so if you promote one of those top 3, then number 4 slides into the top 3, and so on as you work down the list. The caveat being, if you have just cause for not promoting somebody on that list, you can in fact pass them by permanently. So you can pass somebody twice. The third time you have to give them written explanation of that just cause for why you are not promoting them. And this is where I believe your previous question would come into play. If somebody had something in their internal affairs file, so for instance, somebody's passed the test, they're on the list, but then they have an allegation of misbehavior that is sustained and is significant, perhaps, well, you could pick whatever you want to pick, but there is some significant corrective action or discipline that has been applied in the recent past that gives me as the chief pause that I do not believe they can effectively be a supervisor. As long as that meets the threshold, the legal definition of just cause, then I can in fact say, no, I'm not going to promote that person. My hands are not completely tied. Outside of that, yes, I would say you kind of are at the mercy of the list. And so even if you don't think the person is a perfect candidate, if they have passed the process and they're on the list and I don't have just cause and the timeline is within that 45 days, I am required to make that promotion. And so that is certainly a concern at times, especially if you get deep down into that list. And that's one of the reasons we made the change to go to a 1-year list rather than a 2-year list, because sometimes we have a number of promotions during a 2-year period and you get down lower on the list where you have some of those concerns. So that's one of the things we remedied by making it a 1-year list, but then you're also at the mercy of who applies and who passes. We recently had a situation where we did not have a large number of folks on that list. And years ago, we would have 20, 25, 30 people apply and take the test for sergeant. We saw recently in the last couple of years where that number was much lower. The good news is we have just had a promotional announcement and it just closed in the last few days for sergeant. And we have well in excess of 20 people that have signed up to take that test. So things are looking better, I would say, but certainly those concerns are valid.
Madam Mayor, Chief, you've both done a nice job of talking about some of the things that have changed in the last year, 18 months. What I'm hoping to get from your next part of the presentation is what specifically are we going to look at post investigation? And I think that's where you're going, but I'm hoping that we can get some clarity there because there's a lot of things that have changed, I think, throughout. So I'm hoping for that.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Willits, yes, that is the hope. I will cover some of these things. And I think I would just offer that we knew some of the things that needed to happen even before being pointed out by Mr. Bromwich. And those are the things that we have taken action on. And then certainly there are things that were pointed out by him that we recognize as needing action. And those are the things we'll be addressing next. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I guess I did have one question, and I think it was just some unclarity on, is part of the system checking somebody's IA file or past complaints, or is there something that triggers that? Or is it just something that, like, if you know that there's something that's in there, you go ahead and, take that into account? Or is there actually a spot in the process where you say, this is where we actually check the IA file?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, the answer to that is yes. Generally speaking, our department is small enough that members of command staff are aware if there have been recent internal affairs activities and would normally just trigger that because there's something there. In the past, for promotional processes, there have been times where there has been a checkbox, if you will, internal affairs files reviewed so that we make sure of that. And we can certainly make sure to include that in the future, especially as we grow and the organization gets bigger. It may not always be the case that we're aware of everything or remember everything. So we can certainly put that into place. And then going back to, I think, a previous question of where does that fit in? Does it come in the oral board interview? Does it come in the practical assessment? How do we take into account previous performance? And I would say both of those two categories take into account previous performance as a police officer, because we are looking at their ability that they can only do well if they've performed in the past and learned the things they need to do to be able to perform those tasks in those practical scenarios. So it's a little bit of both, but I would say we definitely can make sure that we review the internal affairs findings for relevant history. You know, the last year, the last 2 years, the last 3 years, certainly we wouldn't hold something against somebody that was 15 or 20 years old if they had shown marked improvement. But thank you. Okay, so the items that I will cover next are in this order: the critical incident task force process. And there were some concerns and or recommendations that came from Mr. Bromwich about that. I will also cover the on-body video. And I think specifically what we want to cover is muting and when we record, when we don't, and when officers are allowed to mute their audio as part of that video recording. And then there was a recommendation for exit interviews to look at what people's experience was when they were employed by the City of Boise Police Department and why they would be leaving, and if there were any indications of problems or issues perhaps of racism or things that they had experienced. And if those interviews are not being conducted, why not, and how do we improve that? So we'll talk about that process. And then lastly, I will address performance reviews and give you a little bit of history and explain what we are planning to do in the future with that. So let's jump into the critical incident task force. The memorandum of understanding regarding the critical incident task force was just recently revised and executed in November of 2022. So those things have been updated, and the various agencies in the Ada County CITF are represented on the screen. So obviously Boise, Ada County Sheriff's Office, Meridian Police Department, Garden City Police Department, and the Idaho State Police are part of this task force. What we have done with that, and I think I would like to just take a quick moment to address some of the concerns that Mr. Bromwich brought up in his report. He indicated that he did not necessarily care for this model because his experience, at least, was that other agencies put these types of cases on the back burner because they have their own cases to work. And that was the reason why sometimes these cases take so long to investigate and come to a conclusion. My personal experience here is actually just the opposite of that. These cases go to the top of the priority list, and we all work together and make this a #1 priority when a critical incident happens. And so the detectives that all come out and work those cases, there is a need and an urgency to put that at the top of the list, and they work very well. Our relationship with our fellow agencies in this valley, frankly, is better than it has been in a long time. And we work together to make sure those cases receive priority status and attention. Where we do come into some issues, and especially those that take a long time, are things like if there is a death, the coroner's report, the toxicology screens, some of the laboratory investigative processes. We end up waiting months and sometimes more than a year for some of those results to come back. We are working with our partners in those regards to make some pretty vast improvements in some of those timelines. We have been in discussions with the new coroner of Ada County, and he recognizes some of those issues and incidents take way too long and is committed to speeding up that process. And they're working through some backlogs and things at the Ada County Coroner's Office. But with their new facility coming online, their staffing being where it needs to be, we are confident that those timelines will be improved, and then working with the lab to get toxicology results back quicker. I think you will see some of those concerns being addressed. And I truly have confidence in the critical incident task force model that we've had in place for over 2 decades, that it works efficiently. We are going to be able to address the concerns that are brought up. But with that, the goal certainly is to decrease the timeline for the review and the uncertainty that officers go through when they are part of this process. And so what we have done internally and are in the process of doing, we've already made changes to our Office of Internal Affairs process. It used to be that we waited until the Critical Incident Task Force investigation was complete. It went out to the prosecutor's office outside for a review, and then a charging decision was made. And then we began our internal affairs process. We have started those just in the last few months. We've made the change and the decision to start our internal affairs process almost simultaneously and do a parallel investigation, if you will, one on the criminal side, the other on the administrative or internal side. And so we have actually instituted that, and that we believe will make a vast difference in the timelines and how long officers have to wait for those interviews to happen, for those processes to be complete. And so we are able to review those reports. We've had great cooperation from the CITF investigators in just the last couple that we've started. So we plan to make those changes certainly permanent and going forward from this time that we start those processes sooner. We've received great cooperation in obtaining the documents from other investigative agencies as quickly as possible. And those reports, like I said, they've been very forthcoming in helping us with that. And then our internal process is really to review the incident for adherence to policy and for training issues. And that's the portion we can do relatively quickly, while the criminal portion is winding its way through that process. Any questions on that topic before I move on? Thank you. The next one is the on-body video, and we have updated a policy. It's in draft form for final review and sign off before it's pushed out to the department, but it will address things like Mr. Bromwich had some questions and recommendations, exactly when to activate the body camera. And we have that in policy now, but again, we're making some changes and some different requirements. It will describe the limited circumstances. So this will be clear in policy when muting is authorized, because an officer has the ability to mute the audio recording while still continuing the video recording process. And there are certain very limited circumstances where it would be appropriate for them to do so based on certain privacy concerns, certain discussions that they may have with city legal if they're seeking legal advice on a particular case. Those things you would not necessarily want recorded and available for public view. And so the policy will very closely describe what those limited circumstances are. And also, we have instituted and will continue to make sure that our supervisors are not only reviewing body camera footage related to use of force incidents or complaints, but doing random audits of the officers and reviewing body camera video from different calls that they may be on that normally wouldn't receive scrutiny or oversight or anything from a supervisor because they weren't there and it hasn't resulted in a complaint or use of force. So that will be part of our on-body video camera policy going forward. And then we are aligning to make sure that our policy is in agreement with the expectations from our Boise City prosecutors, as well as our Ada County prosecutor partners, and making sure that we are operating under the parameters that they want us to as well. So those are things, again, that policy has been created. It's in draft review form once that's completely signed off on. And I would suspect that should be in the next couple of weeks, probably. Then that would go into effect and be pushed out so that all officers then receive it and sign off on it.
Madam Mayor, Chief Weiner, do we currently have the technology for the body camera to be triggered once a sidearm or a taser is unholstered?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Nash, we do have that capability with the package that we currently are using with Axon. It has a sensor in the holster. Unfortunately, that sensor only works with the 9mm holsters. It's very spotty with the other caliber that we authorize, which is the 45 caliber firearm. We are in the process of transitioning everybody to that 9mm handgun, so that by this fall, September, I believe, is the rollout date that everybody will be transitioned away from the 45 to the 9. And then that makes the holster much more reliable in that signal being activated when the firearm is drawn. So we do have that. And it's also, I believe, activated with the taser. So when a taser is deployed, that activates the camera. I'm not sure if it's when the taser is drawn. Do you know that, Deputy Chief? I don't believe it's when the taser is drawn, but when the taser is activated, the camera comes on.
Do we
So-
anticipate that the policy would require that technology be used by individual officers come this fall?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Nash, that is the expectation, is that if we give them the tool that works that way, that they really don't have any choice in the matter. But yes, the holster will be automatic and the signal is automatic, so that everybody will be under the same equipment issuance and process. So it should be universal.
Thank you.
Okay, the next topic I'd like to address is the exit interviews. Past practice is that anyone who leaves employment with the city is able to participate in an exit interview, and that is generally done through human resources with the city. My understanding is that that's sometimes a little hit and miss. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Our future practice at BPD is that we are going to take over the responsibility for coordinating that. We will lead that in coordination with HR and city legal. My recommendation has been, and what we have implemented as recently as today, we had an employee resign yesterday. And so we actually coordinated with HR and used one of our background investigators to conduct that exit interview with that employee. It made sense to me that that would be the right person to conduct that interview, because they would, generally speaking, be the ones who conducted the background check when that person was hired. And so they would have that information or relationship, especially if it's somebody who left the agency within the first year or two, or during training, during academy or FTO or probation. And my understanding is that that actually went pretty well. We partnered with our HR partners to conduct that interview. And then we will take that feedback and look for trends. If there is anything concerning in that exit interview about our processes, about whatever the case may be, we will look at that, and that will rise to the chief's office level. The deputy chief and myself will get feedback from those exit interviews and track those trends and look for anything that we may need to make in the way of changes in regards to that. My understanding in this most recent one today is that there was some positive feedback received from the employee about things that he experienced through the hiring process, and some things that he pointed out that we had actually made some recent changes in. And he said that was actually very good, and spoke highly of it. We'll see as time goes by if there are other things that are positive or negative that we can take action on.
Madam Mayor, Chief. So it sounds like in the past it was sporadic, and now there's a much more focused effort. Is the goal to have 100%? Is it to have 90%? Like, what's the plan, and what does success look like in terms of gathering this feedback?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Willetts, that is the goal, certainly, is to have 100% of our employees who depart the agency participate in an exit interview. Certainly, we wouldn't force somebody to if they don't want to. And sometimes things are rather quick and they may not be available, but we will do everything we can to make sure that we give them at least the opportunity and let them know that we would like to speak with them. And that I think we can do that much more nimbly in-house than we can coordinating with HR downtown. Sometimes we can just make it happen rather quickly, but we will absolutely coordinate those efforts with HR and legal to make sure that we are using the same format and documents and maybe questions and as well as implementing some that we may have particular to the police department that they may not cover in other city departments.
Madam Mayor, Chief, you may have just provided some clarification there as far as what coordination means. It means using the same practices that they use in the same baseline. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're present during that conversation.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, I think to start with, we would like them present, and in this particular instance, they were present. But as we get farther down the road and become more comfortable and it becomes more routine for us, we'll certainly coordinate with HR to say, are you comfortable with us kind of taking the handoff and doing it on our own now, as long as we provide that information back to them and they get a copy of those interview reports. And I would assume that once that comfort level is reached, that they would be okay with us doing it on our own, but we'll certainly respect their desires and wishes along the way.
And Madam Mayor, just one follow-up there. Appreciate the clarification. The second question I had related to that was, I couldn't quite tell, did you say the person doing the exit interview was somebody who had a relationship with the person, a past relationship, or are they not working together?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, the person that I believe is the right one for that is the background investigator. So the person, when that person was onboarded and brought into the department, the investigator conducted the background check and interviewed. It's a pretty extensive check, interviews family, friends, neighbors, associates, all kinds of people are interviewed. And so that background investigator has a pretty good picture of who this person is and what their history is. And they've also had some contact through the hiring process with them, not necessarily from that point forward, but they at least have the history with that person. So they would know them. They would be a somewhat familiar face because they would have been involved in their hiring. And I feel like that's the right person because they haven't been involved in the rest of it to be able to go back to them, because it's generally been a cordial and friendly relationship. So I think that's probably our best bet to get open and honest feedback.
Thanks for that clarification.
Absolutely. Next, we will talk briefly about performance reviews, and I am cognizant that our time is short.
When we've got at least till 5:15, the exec can be short. So keep going.
Okay.
We're not going to
thank
cut
you.
this off. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. We are working with and will continue to work with. This is one of those that's not very far down the tracks, if you will, yet, but it is my goal and my intention and one of my priorities once we've accomplished some other things. This is kind of next on the list. The Boise Police Department has not had a formal performance review like annual evaluations or those types of things in place for a number of years. And the history on that goes back, I'm not sure how many years, but quite a few years, because partly, regardless of what was in the performance review for an officer, because of the collective labor agreement, whether you did a great job or just an average job, your raise was the same regardless. And so we were spending a lot of time and effort with our supervisors writing evaluations that didn't seem to make a difference in the end, and with priorities at the time. And again, this is me remembering back vaguely. I don't know that I was in a position at all related to making the decision, but I remember at the time that was the reasoning behind it, that we were just going to stop doing these because we had other things we had to focus on. And we weren't getting that much bang for the buck, if you will, for the effort that was going into those. Fast forward to today, I think it is an opportunity as well as an obligation for us. We have to have some formal evaluation process, performance review for officers and for professional staff, because how else will they know what the clear expectations are for their jobs, and how will they know whether they're meeting those expectations or not? So our goals are to set those clear standards. Whatever the instrument is that we decide on, we will institute a performance review system and plan so that we can document positive performance, identify growth opportunities, aid in the promotional process. And this is where I think that goes back to your question, Councilmember Halliburton, about how do we talk about what they've done in the past when it comes to promotional processes. We look at a performance review, and without those in place, I just think that's a glaring omission, and I understand why we did what we did when we did it. But I think the time is certainly here that we need to institute these performance reviews for all of our contract employees and frankly, all of our professional staff as well. I think the reasons are probably plain and obvious, but we can utilize these because in the more recent history, you have to do something really, really outstanding to get a department award, right? Some kind of commendation or act of bravery or something that rises to a really high level, or you have to really mess up so that you're getting disciplined or corrective action applied. And there's not much in the middle. A performance review can give us that opportunity to recognize good behavior, to set expectations, to hold folks accountable to those expectations, and that set goals for improvement in the future. Even if somebody's performing at a very high level, we always want to do better. So that is certainly the plan in the future. We're not very far down that road, but we are absolutely committed to implementing performance reviews in the near future, and we will be working to see what that looks like. If it's the Connect Boise format that I think most of the rest of the city is certainly familiar with, if we can make that work for this, we will absolutely do so. If there's some other need to have a different mechanism, we can look at that. But that is the plan as far as performance reviews. I see Deputy Chief Brooks has something to share. Please.
Mayor, members of council, I want to roll something back I said earlier. A team member of mine actually sent me a message about something that I had forgot about the promotional process, and I believe it was in regards to a question that council member Bajan had asked. As part of the promotional process, one of the tools that is utilized and submitted by the employee's supervisor is a supervisor evaluation as part of the application process. So if a person is applying to be a sergeant or a lieutenant, that person's supervisor, as part of the application process, has to fill out a form to identify some information that they could provide on that applicant. And I had forgotten about that step in the process, and I wanted to correct that information.
That almost sounds like a performance review.
It is certainly one of those, but it's only when somebody is applying for promotion or for selection to a specialty position. And those are reviewed up through and including the chief's office through the entire chain.
Madam Mayor, Chief, I'm really glad to see that you are working on bringing this back. I think it's really important. I think every single employee deserves a performance evaluation. I also think that there's really good performance evaluations and really bad ones, and we can probably all think back about when we've been part on either side there. One of the recommendations that we got from the investigation was that there was some leadership development training. And this is one of those areas where I really see there being a great opportunity to provide some of that leadership development training. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or feedback as far as what's in place to provide that sort of training if you were to bring this back.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, thank you. Yes, indeed. I think that's certainly one of the things that was talked about. And I think it was in respect to being insular as well as leadership development, and to let folks know some of the things that are in place. We have developed in-house a Sergeant's Academy. We just finished that. It's a 2-week, 80-hour school for new and prospective sergeants to help them have the understanding of what that job will entail and what the requirements are. And certainly components of leadership are throughout that training. We have similar things in place throughout the department, because leadership really starts the day an officer is hired or a day a member is hired. And I heard a definition at a recent conference I was at just a couple of weeks ago regarding leadership, that leadership is really influencing someone else. So every employee is a leader in some regard, whether they have a formal leadership role or rank or not. And so we are absolutely committed to not only each of our specialty positions receiving updated and current training and going to conferences and places where we can observe best practices, but that is certainly the case for sergeants, lieutenants, captains, the deputy chief, and the chief. If we are not honing our skills and looking outward to see what others are doing and how they're doing it, as I've mentioned before, in a setting like this, many people across the country have looked to Boise in certain times in certain respects for the way we do things because we do things well, but we absolutely have to be looking outside. And so things like the FBI National Academy, the Northwestern University School of Police Staff and Command, we actually have one of our captains attending right now. He's out of town for the next 3 weeks. SMIP stands for?
Currently, we have a captain who is in Boston at the Senior Management Institute for Police that's run by the Police Executive Research Forum.
Madam Mayor, this is probably, I guess, my final comment, I believe. I'm certainly in support of professional development. I think when it comes, especially for leaders who are working on giving clear performance evaluations, expectations, and supporting people through that process, I think that's one of the best areas that we can really invest in as far as resources and development goes. And I'm certainly on board for, this and what we talked about earlier with looking at past IA files being part of a checkbox in that process. And I 100% agree that, somebody who's maybe had an issue before in the past, the great part about the performance evaluations is that they know it, they have the ability to grow and move on. And so I don't know that, one single complaint necessarily bars someone from being there, but a checkbox, where you're looking into those as well as somebody's performance, I think is just a really vital part of somebody, moving through that process. So I'd certainly be supportive of both the professional development to help, with those performance reviews, as well as making performance part of that process.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, thank you for that input. We will absolutely make sure that we take those into account in the future.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you so much for addressing, really all of the things that were on the list after we heard from Michael Bromwich. One of the things that I didn't see, and I'm hoping you can follow up on, is he had some recommendations around more rigorous academy standards. Specifically, he had some feedback that not very many people or everyone makes it through academy. Once they get into academy, they make it all the way through. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about academy standards and how a recruit moves through that, and if in fact they all do graduate from academy.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Woodings, Council President Woodings, thank you for that. And that was one of those topics that we absolutely wanted to address, but there was a lot of somewhat tedious information. And so we chose to do that in a memo form. I don't know if you have seen that or not in preparation for this, but I would be happy to discuss it a little bit if you would like in this forum.
Yeah, just give us like the 2-minute synopsis for the public.
I'll do my best in 1 minute and 40 seconds. So the issue was that Mr. Bromwich was concerned that in the last 10 years, Boise Police Department had not fired anybody from the academy. And he indicated that the general numbers across the country that he was familiar with were somewhere between 10 and 25% of police departments 10 and 25% of police officers were fired from academies across the nation. So I wanted to put together some numbers and provide them to you. For the last 10 years, BPD hired 203 officers, and we're specifically talking about sworn members, 203 officers. Currently 147 of those, maybe 146 counting yesterday's, are still employed. So 56 of those 203 have separated from employment for a variety of reasons. And then of those 56 who have left, 33 separated for performance-related reasons. Now, we give officers the ability to resign in lieu of termination under most circumstances. And so I detailed some of the numbers of how many left during the academy resigning in lieu of termination, how many left in the FTO program or the field training program. 13 of those did that. 5 left during the academy. 9 left while on probation after completing field training. 6 officers were fired or resigned in lieu of termination for performance or misconduct after they got off their probationary status. So Of those 203 officers that were hired, that's kind of the breakdown. 23 others left for other reasons, and those are detailed in the memo. But in essence, it boils down to about 27% of officers who were hired are no longer with the agency for a variety of reasons. 16% separated for performance-related issues, which is right in that number that he had indicated. He was familiar with 11% separated for non-performance related reasons. And then there were a few various other miscellaneous reasons.
Thank you for that. And I know, I mean, just anecdotally talking to friends who have been through academy, it is tough, very tough and very rigorous. So I appreciate you offering that additional context.
Madam Mayor, Council President Woodings, thank you. And I would say, yes, it is tough, but again, when we are doing so much on the front end for recruitment, hiring, picking folks that we believe will be successful, we expect them to frankly come through the academy. It is unusual for us to lose people in the academy, though it does obviously still happen. We just don't feel it's necessary to say you're fired in most circumstances. That is all that I have for presentation, and we are past time. So questions, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Chief. And if you need to follow up with this, feel free. Is there anything that wasn't presented on today that Steptoe Johnson suggested that we haven't addressed? Because I know that he had lots of comments, and I just want to make sure that we get all of them on the record.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Willits, I believe, and we took furious notes and we went back and reviewed the entire report. I think we have addressed virtually everything that was of concern. If you can think of something that we missed, we would be more than happy to address it. But I think we got the majority of what he had in the way of concerns, and we've addressed it in one form or another. If there are future questions or concerns that you have, by all means, we don't necessarily need to close the book on this. We are happy to have further discussions and take actions as directed.
Well, thank you. And just to clarify too, the first part of the discussion was actions you'd taken related to the recommendations, but that you were already in the process of taking. And then the second part was actions that you're now commencing the process of taking. So I would imagine that at some point, once those are finalized, there'll be updates on those. And that does cover the spectrum of recommendations that we were provided.
Yes, Madam Mayor.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. With that, I'm going to ask for a motion for exec.
Madam Mayor, I move that we go into executive session for acquisition of real property pursuant to Idaho Code Section 74-206C.
Second.
We have a motion, and a second, clerk?
Phillips,
Yes.
Woodings,
Yes.
Bajent,
Yes.
Halliburton.
Yes.
Nash,
Yes.
all in favor, motion carries.
Thank you. We will be back at 6.